In this video, I'm going to show you how to take inexpensive lumber and turn it into floating shelves using no hardware, and a couple of tips and tricks along the way. The room the shelves will be installed in already has knotty pine beams on the ceiling. This allows us to go to the local big box store and just buy cheap pine 2x10 lumber. The first step in this project is just to mark the boards for the overall length that you want your shelf. For this project, I'll have 2 at 48 inches long and 2 at 47 inches long. Now it's time to cut them to length. You could use a circular saw and a square for this operation, but the miter saw is definitely preferable if you have one. I like to always cut the factory ends off from the 2x10s because they're not actually straight or perfect. Also have to be careful of labels which have staples inside of them, and it can put nicks in your blade. Ask me how I know. As always, I try to avoid measuring as much as possible, so I like to take matching boards and lay them on top of the other and just cut to make the matching lengths. The next operation is moving over to the table saw, and what I like to do is cut about an 1/8 inch off from one side of the board. And what that does is it gives a nice reference point to where it meets the wall. I want to leave the other side natural because we're going for a rustic look and I want it to look like reclaimed wood. If you don't have a table saw in your tool arsenal, you could always use a circular saw for this step as well, or even a jigsaw, or even a handsaw for that matter. It just would take a lot longer. My son Cameron is helping me out on this project, and I'm so glad because we committed to doing this project for my brother and sister-in-law for a Christmas party that they're having, and it's about 4 hours from this point. I continue ripping the edge off from all 4 of our shelf boards, and then I switch over and rip from the same side a 1.5 to 2 inch strip from each shelf. Here's an important tip. Make sure when you're ripping the 1.5 to 2 inches off the back of each one of the boards that you keep those pieces together. This way the grain will match up when the shelves go back together. You don't want to get them mixed up. I held the boards together as they will be installed, and I marked a reference line with a straight edge every 10 to 12 inches across the seam. The next step is to create the tenons to give strength to our shelves. And if you do not have a Festool mortise and tenon machine, don't worry, I'm going to give you some alternatives to use. You can purchase the tenons pre-cut to various lengths, but I really prefer buying them long and just cutting them for what I need for each project. This is the Festool Domino XL. It's super nice for something like this because I can just use the reference line on the top and I set the depth and I go across to each line and I plunge, and it gives me the depth I need for each one of the tenons. I'm using what's called the loose setting, which gives you some side-to-side movement but not up and down. Now I'm going through and just test fitting all of the tenons. It's a tight fit, but that's what we want. Again, I realize some people will not have this machine, so I want to give you some alternatives. You could use a Dowell Jig, which is available online or at hardware stores, and they're fairly inexpensive and they could accomplish the same thing, maybe just not as quick. You also could even use pocket screws on the top of the shelf and just fill them after it's installed. I used the loose setting on the Domino machine because I knew I was going to be pre-assembling them for the next stages, and it would be very difficult to get it back apart if it was on the tight setting. I repeated this operation on each of the shelves, reassembling them to back to where they looked before I did anything. It's like it never even happened. It's like I could return these and they look just like they did when I bought them. The test fit process also allows a perfect time for sanding. And you could actually get away on this project with not sanding, but I'll give you some of the reasons why I feel like it's a must do. First is staining consistency. If you stain these boards without sanding, you're going to get inconsistent results because the wood may be a different grit from cut on a saw blade versus the non-cut side, and it's going to be kind of a surprise on what you get. The next reason for sanding is to make the board appear to be a reclaimed board, and to do that you have to start with a low grit such as 60 or 80 grit, and I go to the sides and I round off the sides and do the front and make sure it has a nice eased round over to make it look like reclaimed wood. Spending a lot of time on this really makes a difference and disguises that it's a conventional 2x10 from the big box store. Most people would agree that the sanding step is not a fun part of the process, but I will say when you have dual dust collectors going with your son helping you and you're just knocking it out quickly, it's not that bad. It's actually kind of fun. I'm sure some of you watching may not have a dual sander setup with dual collection hoses in your shop, and don't worry, I didn't either when I first started out. You can easily use a more inexpensive sander with a dust mask, or you could sand outside to reduce the mess, and you can still get this done. I don't really think it would be easy to do it hand sander. I definitely would recommend buying a cheaper orbital sander, if nothing else, because it just saves so much time. The sanding process you see here took us about 20 minutes to complete for all 4 shelves, and that was going through 3 grits of paper and doing all sides except the back. We didn't worry about the back because we have a fresh, clean cut where it'll meet the wall. We're now just a few hours from the Christmas party, and these shelves have to be installed, so we jump right into stain. It's about an hour away from my brother and sister-in-law's house, so my idea is that the stain will dry on the way to their house. I had the luxury on this project of not having to match stain. My brother and sister-in-law just finished building their house, and she knew that they used Minwax Early American on her ceiling beams, and that was on pine, so I knew the color would be very close. We're just using a rag, and we're wiping it in and wiping off the excess and staying fairly consistent with it. We're wearing gloves, which allows us to turn it while it's still wet and not get it all over our hands, as we have a Christmas party to change into once we get to their house. And of course, I'll point out that the shelves don't have to be stained. This is the point where you could also do an oil finish, or you could paint the shelves in the same manner where you don't have to do it on site. It's much easier to do in the shop or your garage. Just remembered I didn't share to you where this technique of shelf install came from. It was about 5 years ago, and I had ordered some floating shelf hardware from a manufacturer, and I had a notice that had been back ordered, and I was supposed to install it in just a few days, and I was left with virtually no options. Reflecting back, I guess floating shelves really took off in popularity about 5 years ago, and that's why there was such a lack of hardware for it, and now I think there's more available. But this technique still is applicable because the hardware is generally very expensive, especially if you're doing multiple shelves, and it's just not needed. Okay, 1 hour later, and we are on site. We did not even film the part of loading the van because we were in such a hurry. Here I am using my trusty rare earth magnet to identify the stud locations. The magnet's attracted to the head of the screw, and it's one of the most trusted ways I've found to find a stud. Finding the wood stud locations is a very important part of this step and what makes it super strong, because it gives us the locations of where to drill the holes into the back section of the shelves. This is where we separate the back section from one of the shelves, and I hold it up into place. And this is where I double check to make sure that I was not putting it on the wrong side, as one side is 47 inches and the other side is 48. And I am correct in this one, so I'm moving forward with what I was doing, and that is to use my pencil to mark the locations of the studs on the back part of the board. Super critical that you get the locations of the studs, as this is a big part of the strength of the shelves. And this is where I found out that my niece Corbin is an excellent helper and has the interest. We pre-drilled each of those marked locations with a drill bit that was larger than the head of the screw that we'll be using to fasten it, so it can sit flush. We hold the rear of the shelf in place, and then I use a 5-inch toggle bolt and screw it through this piece of wood and into the studs. Normally I would place a level on this board, but I had the luxury of having the tile just underneath the board as a guide, and I checked the tile before install and it was perfectly level. I went ahead and installed the remainder of the other 2 screws, and then I did the wiggle check, which is very important. This is my favorite part of the shelf installs, and Cameron took the honor on this one. And you just line up the tenons to the side. Sometimes this can be a little bit tricky. Once you get it lined up, all it takes is a few taps, and it's really interesting how the seam just pretty much goes away on this. That's one down. Now we move to the next ones, and we're doing the same method as before. And as usual, we have no shortage of helpers. Whenever possible, we take tasks like this outside so we don't have to worry about cleaning up a mess. On the second shelf up, we do not have the luxury of the tile telling us what level is, so I had to use my level. And I had to use my level because I forgot my laser, which would have made it even easier. It would project a laser line on the wall, but the level worked fine too. I just kept the level on top of the board while Cameron drove the screws into the stud. And once he has it in one, it's enough that I can let go and do something else. Now Cameron, just as before, will add the other screws into the holes we had pre-drilled. A common question I have received in the past has been how hard are these to pull off? And the answer is it takes a fair amount of pressure to get these off. And in a lot of cases like this install, it's perfectly fine with no additional steps needed. If your project involves installing the shelves in a commercial space or a kid's room or any other place that you may not be completely confident on who's going to be around the shelves, you could lock them in permanently by placing a screw through the top and through the tenon, locking them into place. You just need to remember that if you ever want to take them down, as it'll be virtually impossible to remove them without removing that screw. Now let's think back to the first shelf and how easily Cameron just slid it right into place. This one was giving me a little bit of problems because the alignment has to be just right, and there's usually one that's not lined up. That's all it takes, getting it in the right place, and it slides right on there. And I just love how these lock together. For this install, the left side is going to be exactly the same. The only difference is we had to allow for the space between the window frame and the wall. And we did end up having to cut one of them at a slight angle because, as you may be aware, no corners in houses are 90 degrees. They're always a little bit off. Even if they're built completely 90, the drywall crew is going to come in there and change that when they feather out the corner. So it's always generally a little off from 90 degrees. Also a reminder, it's very important to hit the studs each time. If you happen to get a spinning screw, definitely take the time to figure out why, and worst case you can use a drywall anchor, but the studs are always best and strongest. I am remembering to tell you this because it happened to us on this screw and it just needed to be a little bit more of an angle to the right to catch the stud. Time check update. We have about 50 guests arriving in the next 20 or 30 minutes. No pressure. And now it's time for the final shelf to be placed, and Cameron has the honors. And note, this is the shelf that we had to cut a little bit of an angle on because it was rubbing the wall. And let's see if he has as easy of a time as he did the first time. Looks like he's having a slight bit of an alignment problem like I did. I think it's a little bit harder when it's over your head versus in front of your shoulders. I think it's a little bit more effort. It's always the last shelf though, always the last shelf. And this one became a team effort. I'm having to look around to see which one is the culprit on not lining up. And I think we find it about right here, and we snap this one right into place. And here's a final shot of the project in place. I really think it looks great, and we literally had someone pulling up the driveway as we finished the last shelf. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe.